Imagine that you are climbing a mountain. The temperature is approximately minus 15 degrees Celsius, getting colder minute by minute. The air lacks oxygen, it's hard to breathe, and the sun is literally blinding you. Oh, and so several years you've been saving up for expensive equipment and one of the coolest guides out there. But it doesn't matter anymore, as you are about to conquer Everest. You see, not far from you, there's a green boot sticking out of the snow. This means you are now at the height of 8,500 meters. So all that's left is about 350 meters more. By the way, those boots belong to one desperate man who passed away trying to do what you're doing now. In recent years, the mountain has claimed the lives of more than 300 climbers. And in 2023, climbing Everest became a kind of curse. In the first 6 months of the year alone, the death record was broken. The mountain claimed 17 lives. But the worst part is that the bodies of around 200 people are still on the slopes. It is said that there is an unspoken rule in the mountains. No matter what happens, no one is to be rescued. But is it really necessary to follow it? Because at the height of 7,000 meters, you will definitely have trouble breathing without it. So yeah, conquering Everest is a luxury. But no matter how much you pay, no one can guarantee that you'll return alive, or that at least your corpse will return. I mean, no one knows for sure who's the owner of the green boots, right? But his corpse became a notorious landmark on the northern route of Everest. Some people think this is Sewang Paljor. He was part of the Indian team wearing the green boots manufactured by the famous Koflak company, which makes shoes specifically for climbers. Others believe it could be Dorje Morup, who also disappeared on Everest. To cut a long story short, if you die on the way to the summit, you'll most likely not only be left unrescued, but you won't even be able to be identified and buried with dignity. The rescue operation at such heights is a very controversial issue, which is only proved by David Sharp's example. David first tried climbing Everest as part of an expedition in 2003. Though he didn't reach the summit, the alpinist showed incredible stamina among other trekking group members. Sharp suffered severe frostbite during the climb and even lost several fingers. But that didn't stop him from helping an exhausted Spanish climber who was just making his way up the mountain. Sharp shared some extra oxygen with him. A year later, the climber repeated his attempt, but he didn't have the strength to go through the last 350 meters to the top. Apparently, the fact that David decided not to use an oxygen tank played a big role. Climbers love to set records, and an oxygen-free climb to the highest mountain in the world is probably the most dangerous of them all, where you can only rely on your body and endurance. With the same ideas in mind, Sharp went on his third trek. David's mother was very worried about her son, but he kept assuring her that climbing Everest wasn't as dangerous as it was said to be. After all, you'll never be alone on the route. There are other climbers nearby. David started his journey to the top from the base camp on May 13, 2006. Many people advised to take oxygen tanks with him, but he refused. Later, several climbing groups reported seeing a tired Sharp at various points along the route as he was descending. Yet, no one knew if Sharp had reached his goal, or if he had decided to turn back again before reaching the top. A day later, Sharp was spotted in a limestone cave, where the owner of the green boots lies frozen to death. Some members of the group recall that Sharp sat with his arms around his knees as if he wasn't feeling well, but no one stayed with him to help him down the rest of the way. What Sharp said to his mother wasn't really the truth. He just wanted to reassure her. After all, conquering the highest mountain in the world is an extreme activity for any human body. And the fact that you decided to take such a risk is, in the end, only your business. Other climbers have also paid much money to feel the same adrenaline rush and endure the journey. So you shouldn't expect someone to share oxygen with you, as David did with the Spanish climber. And now, David was sitting all alone, slowly losing consciousness from the unbearable cold. He had tried so hard to cope on his own, but now he needed help. Eventually, another climber found the man, gave him medicine and oxygen, and moved on shortly afterward. When David was spotted by the next group of alpinists, there was Maxime Chaya among them, who decided to sit down and talk to Sharp. But as soon as Maxime tried to look into his eyes, he saw that David's face had already turned black. The group members were frightened and began to think of a plan to help, but the other climbers told them to keep going and not risk their own lives. All they could do without harming themselves was to send a radio message to the base camp. However, due to the extreme weather conditions, it was impossible to get help. So, left alone among the cold slopes of Everest, David passed away. His death sparked a series of controversies in the media, raising the question of whether to take risks to help other climbers in need in the harsh mountain environment. After all, David's serious condition was noticed by more than 40 people. Their indifferences make you further lose hope in humanity. Does it mean that in the mountains, everyone rescues themselves? The victim's colleague, Sir Edmund Hillary, was shocked by the situation and noted that such savage, unspoken laws are true only for Everest, and climbers on other Himalayan mountains, for example, would never do that. In his opinion, modern commercial guides only care about their clients' obsession with reaching the summit at any cost, even if it means the life of one of their teammates. Even Sharp's mother, Linda Sharp, doesn't blame the other climbers. In a conversation with a journalist, your duty is to save yourself, not to try to save someone else. But what if you go mountain climbing not alone, not in a group, but for instance, together with a loved one? Francis Yarbo Di Stefano lived in lovely, dynamic ski town, Telluride, Colorado. Many athletic, handsome climbers from all over the world came here all the time, including Sergei Arzentiev, who was nicknamed Snow Leopard because he conquered the 5 highest peaks of the former Soviet Union. Sergei charmed Francis straight away, and the couple later married. Francis shared the mountaineer's passion, and together with him, she tried to conquer the mountains a little at a time. Her fearless determination made her name in history as the first American woman to ski down Everest. Then, the couple set themselves a legendary goal: to conquer Everest, so that Frances could become the first American woman to climb the highest peak in the world. With her achievement, she wanted to show that women's endurance is underestimated. On top of that, the couple decided to do it without supplemental oxygen and a guide's support. At the time, Francis and Sergei had an 11-year-old son, and his parents' plan scared him. The boy even had a terrible dream in which 2 climbers were trapped. They were on a mountain destroyed by a storm and couldn't escape the snow, knocking them down. The boy told his mother about his dream, hoping to persuade her not to go to Everest. But Frances was determined, and she wasn't going to cancel the Everest climb. On May 17, 1998, Francis and Sergei began their ascent from the base camp and reached the North Col. The next day, they reached an impressive height of 7,700 meters, and on May 19th, they decided to climb to the last camp before the summit, which is at an altitude of 8,290 meters. At 1 in the morning, on May 20th, they were to make the final push to the top of Everest. But suddenly, the pair's flashlights broke. Finding themselves in complete darkness, they couldn't move on. On May 21st, the pair tried to resume ascent. However, Francis and Sergei were already exhausted this time. The couple gained about 100 meters in altitude and realized their energy reserves were slowly running out. They decided not to risk their lives anymore, but returned to camp to rest before the final push. On May 22nd, they moved up again. Still, this ascent was painfully slow, each step being unfathomably tough. It was already getting dark because Francis and Sergei were far behind the planned time. Usually climbers calculate the deadline so they don't have to turn back in the dark. Francis and Sergei had been at an altitude of more than 8,000 meters for several days. And this is the most dangerous region of Everest, called the Death Zone. This part of the mountain got its name because there is a catastrophic lack of oxygen here, and the human body begins to fight for survival. At that moment, the climbers regretted not taking their oxygen tanks and began to think about an escape plan. Then, the pair decided to split up for some reason. Sergei returned to camp the next morning to find that Francis hadn't arrived yet. Filled with concern, he set out again, armed with the necessary supplies of oxygen and medicine. At the time, Ian Woodhull and his beloved Kathy O'Dowd, also on their way to the top of Mount Everest, were only 350 meters away from the final point. Suddenly, they saw someone's body in the snow. It was a half-conscious Frances. She was on the verge of death due to oxygen deprivation and frostbite. The woman was wearing only a thermal suit, and the rest of her clothes were scattered around. The thing is that in the last stages of frostbite, you start to feel like you're extremely hot and become so desperate that you might just rip off everything. At that moment, the couple realized that their expedition, which they had been preparing for years, looking for money from sponsors, was over. Kathy began to hug the frozen body to her to keep it warm, and Ian removed the hair from the victim's face and recognized Fancy. Her plan for Everest had been in the newspapers, so he immediately realized whose fate was in their hands. Ian tried to dress her, but Frances's muscles had atrophied. She was like a doll made of cloth. Her arms and legs simply wouldn't bend. Frances kept mumbling, "I'm an American, please don't leave me." To get her dressed took 2 hours. Ian tried to pick up and carry the woman, but it was useless. Moving in such high snow was like trying to run underwater. Then, the man realized this venture was becoming dangerous for them. especially for his partner, Kathy. The couple could not do anything, so they decided to return to the camp for help. They took one last look at Frances. She looked like a real sleeping beauty. Back at the base, Ian tried to contact everyone he could, but no rescue expedition dared to go up that altitude because the weather was quite bad. Sergei, who went to rescue his wife, disappeared without a trace. Later, the climbers found his ice axe in the snow, and only a year later, they found the climber's body. Sergei had apparently fallen from a height and died while searching for his wife. Ian recalls that not a day passed when he didn't think about Frances. A year later, he and Kathy made another attempt to reach the top, and they succeeded. But on the way back, the couple was horrified to see the climber's body again. She lay exactly as the couple had left her. Then Ian and Kathy promised each other to return to Everest again to bury Frances. It took them 8 years and the couple's entire savings to prepare for this expedition. On March 20th, 2007, they reached the woman's body again and wrapped it in an American flag. They also enclosed a note from her son and then pushed her body into the cliff, away from the eyes of the other climbers, who had been photographing her for all these years as if she was some kind of exhibit. As you can see, even a loving partner ready to give up their life to save their partner is powerless against a deadly mountain. Perhaps everything would have been different if they had gone on an expedition with a professional guide. Let's say you've been going for a long time towards some unattainable dream of yours. For example, to conquer Lao Tse, the 4th highest mountain in the world. And now you are at the top of it and have reached it even without additional oxygen. What's next? Well, for example, now you can become a guide for other climbers. Just like Scott Fisher. He founded the iconic travel company Mountain Madness and helped other climbers achieve the same success as he did. In 1996, as part of his company's services, Scott organized the most serious expedition of all, the Everest climb. At the same time, the company, Adventure Consultants, owned by a New Zealand resident, Rob Hall, also applied to climb the mountain. Thus, the competition between the two organizations and their guides began. Who would reach the desired summit first? However, everything didn't go exactly according to Fisher's plans, and he faced a number of problems during the ascent. Some members of his group got sick and weakened, so he helped them return to the camps and climbed back up. Because of this, Scott himself became very exhausted even before the final meters. In the end, the team arrived at the top of Everest at almost 4 p.m. on May 10th, which is almost 2 hours later than the strict deadline for a safe descent. However, Rob Hall's group also reached the summit well after the deadline. By that time, Fisher was extremely tired, feeling sick, and most likely experiencing altitude sickness. It occurs when the tissues and organs of the body don't receive enough oxygen due to the decrease in atmospheric pressure at high altitudes. As you can imagine, Scott, like many other professional climbers, didn't want to use additional oxygen. In this state, a person experiences headaches, dizziness, confusion, and weakness, so they need rest and help. If you don't go down in time, you can develop pulmonary or brain edema, which almost always leads to death in extreme conditions. However, Scott couldn't afford to let that happen. As a responsible guide, he had to get his group back safely. However, the situation was only getting worse. Shortly after the two teams began their descent, a heavy snowstorm hit the mountain, preventing the climbers from reaching the nearest shelter. Fisher was already struggling and instructed his assistants to rescue the team and descend to camp without him. He didn't want to delay anyone because they had to act quickly, and the weather was getting worse. His teammates managed to rescue several members of their group who were unable to cope with the blizzard, and even one person from the rival camp. But when the climbers returned for Fisher, he was already dead. His body was moved off the main route and remains on the mountain to this day. Still, no other climbers from Fisher's team died. Does it mean some guides aren't afraid to put their own lives at risk? Or not? This blizzard was one of the deadliest in the history of Everest because then, along with Fisher, 8 people lost their lives. So, what was going on with the team that was climbing the mountain under the leadership of Rob Hall? Rob was also a fairly well-known climber. He was the second person to climb the mountain on the northern ridge of Ama Dablam in 1980 and Mountain Noomber in 1981. Rob and his colleague, Gary Ball, were very attracted to the concept of 7 summits, which originated as a mountaineering challenge in 1985. He envisioned conquering the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents. But Rob's ambition pushed him to jump over his head. He sought to accomplish this feat in a limited time, within 7 months, devoting 1 month to each peak. He and Gary's journey was to begin with Everest, which is considered the most challenging climb on the list, and they managed to climb all 7 of them indeed. This achievement set a record for the speed of mountain climbing at the time. No wonder clients paid his company, Adventure Consultants, $65,000 to be their guides during the ascent of Mount Everest in 1996. And the climb really went smoothly until the last hours. First, just before the summit, one of the clients, Beck Weathers, had a tough time coping because he suffered from snow blindness. This is usually caused by sunlight reflecting off snow or ice. To ensure Weathers' safety, Hall made the difficult decision to leave the climber to wait at camp for their return. Beck Weathers didn't even know that he shouldn't be upset about it, and in fact, he was incredibly lucky that day. Then, another client had a similar experience. Doug Hansen showed warning signs of exhaustion. As the climbing time dragged on, Hall saw they wouldn't make it to the summit on time. He continued to climb nonetheless, not to lose the competition with the group led by Scott Fisher. And so, with a great delay, Hall's team reached the top. But Doug Hansen was not happy about it. He was already feeling very sick. In addition, a snowstorm suddenly broke out. While everyone else continued down the mountain, Hall decided to stay with Hansen, refusing to leave his client behind. Unfortunately, however, Hansen did not make it. The blizzard was accompanied by winds of 240 kilometers and almost zero visibility. Hansen died. One of Hall's fellow guides tried to save Rob by bringing extra oxygen and water. However, the regulator of the oxygen mask couldn't withstand the low temperatures, and it could no longer supply air. He eventually managed to call his wife via satellite phone from the base camp and send a message. His last words were, "Sleep well, my love. Please don't worry too much." The main cause of the Everest tragedy in 1996 was the pride of the guides and their inability to assess their own capabilities. So be prepared that, no matter how much you trust your intuition or your guide, Everest can take you into its snow forever. Nevertheless, there are still brave souls trying to find people on Everest who are beyond saving. If we recall the most prominent climbers in the history of Everest, we should name the only one with whom all began, namely the British alpinist, George Mallory. He planned to become the first person to conquer the top of the mountain. George first climbed the slopes of Everest as part of a British expedition in 1921, whose goal was to first find at least the most accessible way to the top, which no one had ever reached before. Having determined the right route, a year later, Mallory wanted to reach the mountain's highest point, but an avalanche prevented him from doing so. He decided to finish the job in 1924. At the time, he was 37, and Mallory was afraid that if he thought about it any longer, he would be too old to summit Everest. At the end of May, he and his team began the ascent. However, not all the participants were prepared for the harsh weather conditions of Everest. Some climbers were quickly exhausted, and others were constantly sick, which slowed down the process of conquering the peak. On June 6th, Mallory and his partner, Andrew Irvine, set out for the summit alone because they didn't want to wait for the other participants to get better. George said Andrew was determined to reach the peak of Everest together. On June 8th, the other climbers saw them at about 244 meters away from the summit. Shortly afterward, George and Andrew simply vanished, leaving behind a mystery no one could solve for the whole 75 years. Until the first clue to their fate came from a British expedition in 1933. Mountaineer Percy Wynne Harris came across an ice axe near the summit, believed to have belonged to the missing climbers. When they looked closely, they saw some hand-carved marks on the axe, like a cross. And Irvine's friends said that their friend used to mark his belongings in a similar way. But when Percy Wynne Harris, who also climbed Everest, saw these clues, he assured that this carved cross was made by his guide, a Sherpa, Kuseng Pugla. He marked the ice axe so that it wouldn't be lost or confused with others. As you can see, Kuseng failed in his task and confused people trying to find the bodies of the missing climbers. 3 years later, alpinist Frank Smith allegedly identified the possible bodies of Mallory and Irvine with a powerful telescope during a British expedition to Mount Everest, but he never got to them. And in 1975, climber Wang Hongbao said that he came across the remains of someone's body on Everest. Then, a series of search expeditions began, aimed specifically at finding Irvine and George. Thus, people spent their energy not to conquer the peak, but to find corpses that no one had hoped to find for a long time. And in 1999, using clues from previous expeditions and Wang Hongbao's testimony, the team outlined the search area where the bodies were likely to be left. On May 1st, an American climber named Conrad Anker noticed a large flat rock on the northern slopes of the area. He soon realized it wasn't a rock, but none other than George Mallory. Time had destroyed his clothes, yet the mountain conditions preserved most of his body. The axe was located directly above Mallory's body, a few meters away. This suggested that he died as a result of a bad fall. Unfortunately, Irvine's body was never found. But it is quite possible that he suffered a similar fate. Just think about it. Mallory's body was found 75 years later. But no one will ever know whether he and Irvine managed to reach the top of Mount Everest. It turns out that they lost their lives in vain because their feat will remain a mystery no one will ever solve. I think you've already understood what I'm getting at here. If you also decide to take a chance, you must know you may suffer the same fate. After all, you can't really expect to be rescued by other climbers, and your body might be found many years later when your loved ones might not be alive either. Gelji Sherpa, a Nepalese man self-evacuates a victim on Mount Everest at an altitude of 8,300 meters. During the climb, he decided to turn his clients around to save another climber's life. Usually, such an evacuation requires at least 5 participants, and he carried the victim to the nearest camp on his own. This was the first time in the history of climbing Everest. So, there is hope that you won't be the last. Now, imagine you are a member of the Gelji's team and have been saving for your dream.